to us. And it's, I guess you can call it a rather unconventional topic for a Christadelphian lecture, but I think it's a relatively important one, and the primary reason for this being that what we have, or what we claim to have, is the truth. And if that's true, then we should be able to explain all the aspects of this life, at least to some reasonable degree. I mean, there's nothing that we should have to shove under the rug, and we don't talk about that. And since these are a fact, since we find these in the earth, we need to try to understand them. And I think it's the topic's of particular relevance because of how it's used by the opponents of God and of His Word. You'd be hard-pressed to find a book on dinosaurs written from a creationist perspective. Now, they're out there, but most of the ones that I found are written by one author. So there's not a lot, and, well, there's a lot more of the enemy's works, you can call it, if we're going to call them that. But I think it's a good topic because of all the things that go along with it. You know, when we're talking about dinosaurs, we can't help but talk about carbon dating and all the other dating methods in the fossil record. These are two other things that the evolutionists very boldly claim to be in opposition to the creationist perspective. So by looking at these things, we hope to not only strengthen our faith, but also equip ourselves so when we do almost inevitably engage in conversations about the age of the earth, the creationist, the evolutionist perspective, we are able to defend our Master's word. And not only this, but you will not find any of this in the school system. I know a lot of people are going to college. You will not hear any of these things in those settings. So we're also building a foundation for those younger people who might be going into colleges to know that what their professors are touting as infallible truths are really anything but. So perhaps it's unorthodox, but I hope it is something that others find benefit from. So when we're talking about dinosaurs, there's essentially three classes of thought. You can call it the evolutionist, where it presently claims the dinosaurs lived on Earth for 165 million years, and they died out 65 million years ago. And then we have what I've called creationist A, and that's that dinosaurs were created by God, but they were part of a separate creation, or a previous creation than us. And then we have creationist B, which is that dinosaurs were created by God, but were part of the same creation as you and I, roughly 6,000 years ago. So that would mean that dinosaurs existed roughly 6,000 years ago. The first thing we notice with these things, the difference is time. You know, the evolutionists say that 65 million years ago they disappeared. Why is this? Well, truthfully, it's because their theory of evolution requires them to be that old. I mean, if we're thinking of things gradually changing over time, how drastically different these creatures are than what we see today. And if they slowly change to get to what we have today, there is a lot of time that has to pass if you go by gradual changes. So you have to stretch further and further back into history to try and account for the diversity and the complexity of life on the earth. If the earth isn't millions of years old, then their theory falls flat on its face before it even gets going. Now, one way that the scientists, they try to prove the old age of the earth is by dating methods. Now, in theory, these seem plausible, but there's actually, I forget how many kinds of dating that they use, but the most prominently known and frequently used is carbon dating. Now, the scientific community have promoted this as being almost infallible, and it's reliable beyond question. But as I will hope to demonstrate, this could not be further from the truth. But the thing is, what I'm about to tell you, the public does not know about. Anybody who wants to learn these things has to go and seek them for themselves. So I do want to go over how carbon dating works. Now, don't be intimidated by any of the scientific words. I think some people want you to get intimidated by it. But it's really simple, and I think we'll end with an illustration that helps it make the most sense. But essentially, it's a dating method that just simply compares the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in a particular sample. Now, carbon-14 is a naturally occurring element that's produced from the cosmic rays of space and the sun interacting with our atmosphere. So you see it's penetrating our atmosphere, and with the other stable carbon-14 atoms in the atmosphere, these combine with the oxygen atoms and form carbon dioxide. So carbon-14 does not exist until it is in our Earth's atmosphere. It's created in our atmosphere, which is important, as we'll see later on. But essentially, it takes the form of CO2 when it mixes with all the other gases in the atmosphere. Now, plants, as we know, they take dioxide. So they take in carbon-14 and carbon-12. Now, the animals of the earth, they eat the plants, so they have carbon-14 and carbon-12 in them. And we eat the animals, and so you can see how just by consumption, and also by us just breathing, because we breathe in amounts of carbon dioxide as well, all living things have carbon-12 and carbon-14 in them. And this is why it can only be used to date living things. Now, why is it used for dating? Well, carbon-14 is radioactive, which simply means that it's not stable. And you think of like water wants to equalize, if you can call it that. So these unstable atoms, they want to become stable. So they decay into another element. And this, actually, it decays into carbon-12. Now, presently, supposedly, this rate of decay can be measured, and it's called a half-life. So if you look on the left, you see you start at time 0, and let's say a certain sample has 1,000 grams of carbon-14. Now we step down 5,700 years roughly, it will have lost half of its carbon-14. That's why it's called a half-life. And so every roughly 5,700 years, it loses 50% of its carbon-14 until it's gone. As this says, the half-life of an atom is the amount of time it takes for half of the atoms in a sample to decay. And then eventually, when all the carbon-14 is gone, all you have left is carbon-12. So when an animal is living, it's continually taking in carbon-14 because it's breathing and it's eating. When it dies, however, it stops taking this in. So from this point on, it's just strictly a loss of carbon-14. Now, what they do is they assume this, and then they measure the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. So if there's only carbon-12 left, it means it's, I forget what the graph said, but it's just crazy, crazy old. But if there's some carbon-14 left, you can kind of do the math to figure out when that animal died, or when it stopped bringing in carbon-14. In theory, that's great. However, there are a number of assumptions that this is based upon. The first being that we know the initial amount of carbon-14 present when the organism died. So imagine you walk into a room and you see there's a candle that is burning. And somebody asks you, I want you to tell me, figure out how long that candle has been burning. So let's say right now the candle, as you see it, is 5 inches tall. So you could do some things. I mean, you could sit there and you can watch and you can measure the rate at which the candle's burning. So let's say it's just, it loses an inch every 30 minutes or something like that. So now you have your rate. So you can work back from that. But the problem is, you have to know how tall the candle was when you first got it. I mean, because you can continue this equation until the candle's 1,000 feet tall or 1,000,000 feet tall. You have to know how tall the candle was at the beginning so you know when to stop your equation. And that's the thing that we just don't know. We don't know how much carbon-14 was present in an animal when it died. And this is further supported by the fact that you can take two samples from the same organism and come up with completely different, I mean, I'm talking about by millions of years, different ages. It's not very reliable, if you ask me. We also have to assume the initial ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. Because when, they both exist, but they exist depending on where you live, the types of vegetation that are taken in, the ratio is different. And to make this even more difficult, again, they don't have just carbon-14 in them, they have carbon-12. So if we're trying to determine a rate, we have to know what we started with. Because it's not 100% carbon-14, and there's no way to know this. You can't go back in time to collect a sample at the time. And a testament to this is there's a sample that was acquired from a living penguin. And when they tested it, it came out to say that it died 8,000 years ago. Why? Well, because it already had carbon-14 and 12 present within the penguin. And in their ideal world, it would be all carbon-14. You got time zero. But that's just not realistic or factual. We also have to assume the decay rate of carbon-14 has remained constant over time. And there's no way to prove this. Currently, it's 5,730 years, but that's under the present conditions. We have no way of knowing, especially when you use their model of millions and millions of years, whether that's been constant or not. And given all the natural disasters and things that occur, you have to say no, but we don't know how much. So again, it's another assumption that we have to take. We also have to assume the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has remained constant throughout all of time. Now this has been definitively proven to be false. According to another paper cited by Show, we are adding so much carbon-12 to the atmosphere at the current rate of fossil fuel usage that by 2050, brand new materials seem like they're 1,000 years old. So simply because of the industrial age, this has had this much of an effect on the dating process. And then lastly, we assume the strength of the Earth's magnetic field has remained constant. Because remember, I don't know if I got it. Well, I guess I can't go back. But anyways, remember that carbon-14 is not formed until it gets through the magnetic field and enters our atmosphere. So if we have stronger magnetic field, that means less rays are going to come through, and therefore less carbon-14 is produced. However, I didn't put this quote on the slide, but it's been proven that the Earth's magnetic field has been continually weakening. It says, though complex, this history of the Earth's magnetic field agrees with Barnes' basic hypothesis. Oh, there's my quote there. That the field has always freely decayed. The field has always been losing energy despite its variations, so it cannot be more than 10,000 years old. So, all of these things together really create a problem, and it's just simply too much uncertainty to boast with the certainty with which they boast these things. They say it's one of the most reliable kinds. They have no way of proving it. But there's countless other examples of this. Shells of living mollusks have been dated with this, only to find that the method said it's dead for 23,000 years. Again, we mentioned the penguins. The seal had been dead for 30 years, carbon dated, and the results said it was 4,600 years old. The examples continue on and on. The freshly killed seal was 1,300 years ago. Snails, 27,000 years ago. Living snails, that is. And then there's a case of an Allosaurus bone, which was really interesting. So what happened here is a group of scientists, they sent in this bone sample, but they didn't tell them what it was from. And so they wanted to see how accurate these things were. And the results, as you can see, it's kind of hard to read, but where it says conventional date there, they're estimating that by carbon-14 dating, it was 16,000 years old, give or take 220 years. So the problem is the Allosaurus was supposed to have died out 140 million years ago. So if you ever look into geographical kind of dating and things like that, it's the same concept. They have to know what layer you grabbed the rock from in order to give it a date. Likewise, they have to know that this is an Allosaurus, and they have to make that date fall into their model. Otherwise, it's false. So I'd like to quickly mention one other dating method to show that these relate not only to like organic, as in living organism dating systems, but to inorganic. One of these is called potassium argon dating. So this is like things that were not alive and did not bring any carbon-14. But it's a similar test. Scientists got dates of 164 million and 3 billion years for 2 Hawaiian lava flows. Problem is, these lava flows happened only about 200 years ago, in 1800 and 1801. So we see a very kind of foolish pattern. We have a sample of a known age, radioisotope dating or carbon dating, or all these things, it's proven to not work. However, when we have a sample of an unknown age, we assume it to work. I really don't need to say any more about that. Now, some dating methods are fairly accurate, but again, they're only accurate so far as we know all the different factors. Now, the world before the flood, I believe, was a completely different looking Earth. Don't look at that. I pressed that too early. We can't talk about this a whole lot now, but it explains why we have such crazy numbers and such different numbers from these samples. So I firmly believe they were created millions of years ago, but that they were created by God at the same time you and I were. Is there evidence for this? Well, if you look at the screen, you might have a hint of that. This is the soft tissue of a triceratops horn that was found in the desert. Now, the really interesting thing with this is the desert is one of the worst places to preserve things because in the daytime it becomes incredibly hot, and in the night it becomes very cool. So when you continually heat and cool things down, that's one of the best ways to destroy these kinds of things. It's also, soft tissue is the first tissue to disappear in this world. So the fact that even if this was, let's say, 5,000 years ago, the fact that that is existent still is incredible, even by our method. And you can see they're stretching it, so it's not dried out. It's still got some elasticity to it, which means this is not as old as they say. Now, the scientists who discovered this, they believed that this was evidence of a young Earth, and they were fired because of it. Now we have, these are the red blood cells of Tyrannosaurus rex. Now this, along with the Triceratops horn, this baffled scientists, and there's a bunch of people that write in saying, this is a fraud, but it's simply not. Numerous tests were done, and they showed these red blood cells in great detail. And you can see again, there's still some elasticity in here. It's just incredible. It simply could not survive millions of years, much less thousands of years. Now here's an excerpt from an article. It's over another finding. It says, unlike teeth, which can survive for hundreds of millions of years, so they say, soft tissues are among the first materials to disappear during the fossilization process. Even so, scientists have found intact soft tissue in dinosaur bones. The most famous case dates to 2005 when Mary Schweitzer, I guess that's how you say it, of Northern California State University found collagen fibers in the fossilized leg bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex. But such discoveries are rare and have previously occurred only with extremely well-preserved fossils. The most extraordinary thing about the new find is that the fossils they examined are relatively poor condition, to put it kindly. So this isn't some sample that was, this is like the perfect preservation process. This is a bad example, and yet we still find collagen tissues in these creatures. Now they found other things that defy their model, and then this is, I found really interesting. So they claim that dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. Now, they also claim that grasses did not appear until 10 million years ago, or 10 million years after that. So dinosaurs die out, 10 million years go by, grasses appear on the scene. However, they recently found remnants of grasses in sauropod stomach. This says here that a microscopic examination of fossilized dinosaur dung from India now shows that the last mass land-eating dinosaurs munched heaping helpings of at least 5 different types of grasses. How do you account for that when there's supposed to be a 10 million year gap between these two things existing? Supposedly they never existed at the same time. Again, you will not see these things in the news. Certain discoveries they'll promote, other ones they'll stick under the cover. However, that's part of the evidence. And if we want to understand the truth, we have to take in all of the evidence. So now the question arises of when did dinosaurs live? And did man ever see dinosaurs? Well, if you ask the government, they say no. After the dinosaurs died out, nearly 65 million years passed before people appeared on the earth. So again, we have the same thing with the dinosaurs and the grasses. Man should not have any idea about dinosaurs until the 17th century when dinosaurs were discovered. The actual word wasn't coined until 1841. This man, Richard Owen, was the one to coin the term. So we have 65 million years gap here. Using simple reason, man should not have any inkling of what dinosaurs looked like or any existence of them prior to this man discovering and naming these things. I don't know if he discovered them, but it was around this time. And yet we find things all over the world like this. Now the picture down in the bottom right, it's been enhanced so you can see the detail better. Here we have a picture of what looks very clearly to be man and a sauropod dinosaur. If you watch Land Before Time, that's a long neck. Now, again, this is obviously drawn by a man. How would they be able to do this unless they actually saw one? Again, they should know no inkling that these animals even exist. Here we have 2 other cave drawings. This one is obviously clearly enhanced at the bottom, showing the same type of creatures, a sauropod dinosaur, obviously drawn by man. Here's another, and this time it actually appears to show people hunting the creature. You can see the long neck and the long tail, which there's no animal on the earth, especially that size to people, that fits that illustration. Now, this was actually, the article I found this on explains that there was an evolutionist guide who took these people along. And on camera, they would not give any thoughts on this. However, off camera, the man admitted that he thought it was a sauropod dinosaur that had somehow escaped extinction 65 million years ago. I don't know how one dinosaur can live that long without having others to reproduce, but such is supposed the case. But the depiction of dinosaurs goes well beyond these cave drawings. This is just some pottery that very clearly represents a stegosaurus. What that would be today, I mean, maybe you could say a turtle, but they don't have those teeth, and they don't have spikes on just the top of their shell and their tail. But it most likely appears to be a stegosaurus. And here we have another one. Again, noting the plate on the back of, the back. This was on a Cambodian temple wall. And you know, these stone carvings can be very, very old. This is called the Ica stone triceratops. Now they found other stones that also have brachiosaurs, tyrannosaurs, and other triceratops. Now one stone, I don't know if I put this quote in here or not, one stone, a carnivorous dinosaur is feasting on a human. And there are other etchings showing tribesmen riding tame sauropods. These are Indian figures that were found, and they were unearthed in, I think it's called Incambaro, Mexico. Very interesting creatures for people who have no idea what dinosaurs look like. But most incredibly is this footprint. Now this footprint has been scanned countless times, and it is authentic, it is real. But what's really I find interesting with this is the fact that the dinosaur stepped in the person's footprint. Now there's another view of this. They took some side scans, and this is how they know it's authentic. You can see the different pressure densities of this rock to show that it's not a false thing. So how can a dinosaur step in a person's footprint unless they exist at the same time? So which very clearly says to me they did not live millions and millions of years ago, but did live alongside with humans. So this brings us to the in the Bible part. Are dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? I believe they are. Let's actually turn up to some scripture. I gave it away again. I didn't even bring my Bible up here. Grab that real quick. Yeah, turn over to Job 40. We'll read verses 15 through 20. That's Job 40, 15 through 20. Well, it's not my Bible, but it'll work just the same. Job 40, verses 15 through 20. Let's see here. Now, Brother Ken had some comments on this. And I really do think that a crocodile fits a lot of these things, but the difficult part is finding the creature that fits every single descriptor of these. And I don't personally believe there's any alive today that does. Job 40, verses 15 through 23. Behold now behemoth, which I made with thee. He's talking to Job, obviously. He eats grass as an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass, his bones are like bars of iron. He is chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. He lieth under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and the fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow, the willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinketh up a river, and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes, his nose pierceth through snares. I just realized my briefcase is right here, so I'm sorry. Anyways, now, most of the book of Job is dialogue between Job and his friends, trying to explain why God has allowed the evil to befall him. So after much discussion, God appears in a whirlwind and through angelic manifestation, of course, and he questions Job about his creative work. He's beholding, says, look at this thing I made, look at this creation, and he's using these things to illustrate his power and his wisdom and strength. Now, this is important to establish because it shows the reason why God is mentioning behemoth. It's to show God's power and to awe in Job. Now, as Brother Ken mentioned, the word is from behema, and it means a dumb or a mute beast, especially any large quadruped or animal. So I think basically it just means a large animal that's got 4 legs. Now, note he says, behold this animal. That means that this is an animal that Job is familiar with. He has to see it in order to behold it. Otherwise, again, it wouldn't do any good with the purpose of God's words with Job here. So God then lists the various noteworthy aspects of the animal. And from all these descriptors, we have to try to figure out what it was. Now, it's often identified as an elephant or a hippo, but as you probably tell from that, the main objection to that is the tail. I mean, they are large and intimidating creatures. And presently, the African elephant's the largest land animal on the earth. The tail, though, especially when compared to the rest of the body, is relatively small. And those two look often kind of ashamed at the size of theirs there. But I would say that it's hard to apply it to that. So I submit to you that it is a sauropod dinosaur. Now, a sauropod is the kind, and this is what we're seeing here. There's different sizes, there's different shapes, but they have a long natural tail, and they're very large creatures. Now, these certainly have a tail that is literally the size of a cedar tree. And I think the description there is well, I'm getting ahead of myself. But the sheer size of these animals is incredible. I mean, I think just recently, within the past year, they found a new species that is now the newest one that they have ever found. The largest one to date is 130 feet long. So that tail right there is taller than most cedars. Now, in regard to the tail moving like a cedar, some very interesting things have been discovered. Now, when scientists they look at the bones of animals, they can determine where muscles and ligaments attached to the bones. And when they do this with sauropods, here's just another slide showing the size of these things. Now, the blue whale is the largest animal on the planet right now, and it's dwarfed by this, I forget what that one's called, it's kind of blurry, but they're big, pretty much. Now, regarding this tail moving like a cedar, by looking at the different spots on the bones where they can tell muscles and ligaments attached to, they discovered that, unlike the old movies, their tails did not drag the ground but were held upright, and being attached to the leg like this, they would sway side to side with every step that they had, much like a cedar tree in the wind. And I think that probably for this descriptor alone, Job would probably know the animal that the Lord was speaking of. Now we then read that this behemoth is specifically as an ox. And here's another reason why I would say it's not necessarily like an elephant. I mean, hippos do graze a lot on grass, but I guess it's similar to an ox. But these animals had teeth specifically designed, they're beautiful creatures, aren't they, for cutting vegetation. Now, with their long necks like this, they'd be able to sweep just enormous amounts of land without having taken a step. But, I mean, unlike an elephant that uses its trunk, this would stoop its head down just like an ox, and it would graze. We learned from verse 16 that this animal's strength is in its loins, and I think that's referring to its hips, and in the muscles of its belly. Now, there's other animals that have strong hips and bellies, but certainly more than any other creature, I think it would be this one. Now, some sauropods, they believe were able to rear up on their hind legs like this, and I think this would relate to this especially the stomach strength. Especially when you have the tail and the heavy neck, most of that is supported by their stomach muscles. Like if you were to turn your hips, you're actually using your abdominal muscles here. So you can see here, their center of gravity is right between their two legs. And in order to hold up that long, it's not just tail muscles. There's a very strong core to this animal. Now in verse 18, we learn something very interesting in relation to the skeletal structure of this animal. You guys hear me still? All right? Okay. We read that the legs, or that his bones, are strong pieces of brass. Now, many Bible versions of this read tubes or conduits of brass. And indeed, one of the many meanings of this Hebrew word is tube. And interestingly, this is exactly what the bones of sauropod dinosaurs were, specifically their necks. They were baffled, these scientists, for how a creature of such size could hold a neck like this. I mean, even the giraffe, you see that compared down to the bottom. The giraffe has a very difficult time sometimes with its neck, and it's got a huge, huge heart to pump blood all the way up that neck. You compare this to these creatures. I mean, if it's got solid bone, it's a lot of weight that has to be supported there. Some of their necks alone reach over 50 feet long. But they've discovered that their neck bones are almost completely hollow. Air made up 60% of their necks. Now, there's a video, I don't think I have it on here. No, a video of a man holding just one of these vertebrae. I don't know why this ain't working. It's probably 3 feet in diameter. He's picking it up and he said it feels like a block of styrofoam. So it really is incredible, and there's incredible design in these creatures. And then when you look at the size of their legs, like that has got to be just incredibly heavy. And some of them can be heavy for us, but in proportion to their size, they're very, very light. So unlike most of the other bones, which were hollow, oh, I'm sorry, here, I'm getting ahead of myself. These neck bones specifically were very hollow. Now he also says that their bones are like bars of iron. Now this word bones is different than the one used in the previous verse, so it's not necessarily referring to the same part of the animal. And it's most often understood to refer to ribs. Now, and this is a perfect case with the sauropod dinosaurs. Unlike their neck bones, their ribs were completely ossified, so it was just solid bone. Very, very strong at that. Now, this next thing, which again, I'm not very good with my slides here, it says that Behemoth is chief of the ways of God. And that's kind of an interesting thing to say. But the word chief appears to mean principal in rank or in order. And I think its use here is to show that God is saying, this is the most impressive animal that I've made. This one shows my ways, my power, and my strength the most out of all of the creatures I've created. And again, he's making a specific point to Job with these things. And it would make sense if you're trying to strike awe and show one, you would use your greatest, most awe-striking example. And when you consider the size of these things, I mean, there's no question about it. This girl doesn't look too happy to be standing next to that one, but it's just the leg alone is twice her size. You look at this one, I think this is one of the largest ones discovered. That man doesn't look like a short man. I'd imagine he's between 5'8" and 6 foot at least. But can you imagine standing next to that thing and knowing that it's alive and moving? I mean, you imagine the ground it covers with a single step. It really is an immense animal. Now in verse 20, let's see, it says, surely the mountains bring him forth food, or all the beasts in the field today. This word mountains is often translated hills, which, they're quite similar. But I think it might simply refer to where this thing eats. Perhaps it's hinting at its height and being able to reach the mountains. I really can't say for sure. But verses 21 and 22 are interesting, and they're probably the most challenging if we're to apply them to a sauropod dinosaur. It's talking about being under the shade of the trees and in the covert of the reeds. However, again, it's a sauropod dinosaur. It's not necessarily like a tiger. It could be like a cat or something like that. We're referring to the kind of creature. And a lot of them were not tall. They were much more longer than they were tall. But there are grasses in South America that I forget how tall they are, but they hide entire herds of elephants. They go in and they just completely disappear. And if we consider the earth, particularly before the flood, I think the oxygen, the atmosphere was much more rich oxygen. I think many things were bigger than they were now, particularly when you consider the fossil record, which would also translate to the plants and the grasses being higher as well. So, regarding this animal's strength and size, God says this animal does not fear the rushing of the rivers. He can also drink up the river in his mouth. Now, this would make some sense with a hippo by the size of their mouth. But again, if these things are around at the time, it would be much more so for these creatures. Moving water would not necessarily, especially fast-moving water, when you have a leg that size, it's really not going to do much. That's like the post of a bridge stomping down into the water. So I believe that when it's talking about behemoth in this instance, I think a sauropod dinosaur is the only one that we know presently that seems to fit these descriptors sufficiently. And if this is the case, then we have an answer, or possible answer, to another important question. When did dinosaurs live? Well, if you read book 40, verse 15, behold now a behemoth which I made with thee. I believe that God created the dinosaurs the rest of this creation. Now, this brings us to Leviathan, which is a little bit more difficult. It's in Job 41, Well, let's just go ahead and read all of it just to, well, get all of it. Because again, all of these descriptors are important. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put an hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? Will he make many supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for a servant forever? Wilt thou play with him as with a bird, or wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? Shall the companions make a banquet of him? Shall they part him among the merchants? Can thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? Lay thine hand upon him, remember the battle, do no more. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down even at the sight of him? None is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand before me? Who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. I will not conceal his parts, nor his power, nor his comely proportion. Who can discover the face of his garment? Who can come to him with his double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. One is so near to another, where can come between them? They are joined one to another. They stick together. They cannot be sundered. By his neesings a light doth shine. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They are firm in themselves, they cannot be moved. His heart is as firm as a stone, yea, as hard as a piece of the nether millstone. When he raiseth up himself, the mighty are afraid. By reason of breakings they purify themselves. The sword of him that slayeth at him cannot hold, the spear, the dart, nor the harbinger. I don't know how to say that word. He esteemeth iron as strong, and brass as rotten wood. The arrow can't make him to flee. Sling stones are turned with him into stubble. Darts are counted to stubble. He laugheth at the shaking of a spear. Sharp stones are under him. He spreads sharp pointed things upon the mire. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He makes sea like a pot of ointment. He maketh path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary, or white, is that meaning. Upon earth there is none his like, or not his like, who is made without fear. He beholdeth all things. He is king over all the children of pride. Now I know that's a lot. It's hard to read long chapters, but we'll bring these things back up. Now we have a lot more information on Leviathan, but it's interesting that it's harder to pinpoint than I think Behemoth might be. Strong's defines this as a wreathed animal that is a serpent, or especially a crocodile, or some other large sea monster. But judging by all these things, it certainly doesn't seem to be anything that's alive today. It's a dreadful creature, and nobody dares mess with it. You can't catch it. You can't really kill it, it seems like. His teeth are terrible roundabouts. We're looking for something with some gnarly teeth here. And again, it seems like it can't be killed. All the weapons of man are in vain. Now, the only difficulty with these is, judging by the fossil record, it's difficult to tell, I should say by the bone structures, to tell whether an animal had skin or scales. So we're kind of left to guess on the scale part. Now the underbelly, as verse 30 describes, it seems like it's covered in some sort of sharp spikes, like pottery, as some translations have it, which leave marks in the mud. So we see that this is it's a sea creature, but it also seems to spend some amount of time on the land. Because I mean, if it's leaving streaks of mud 100 feet in the ocean, man's not going to know that that happens, and therefore there's no point in bringing it up to Job here. Verse 32 is interesting. It reads kind of strange in the King James, but in the New English translation, it says, "It leaves a glistening wake behind it. One would think the deep had white hair." So if you've ever seen a boat going through the ocean, it leaves that white, lovely trail. I think that's kind of what this is talking about. which means that it's probably a fairly fast creature and a fairly large creature as well. Now, what's again really interesting is verses 18 through 21. Now, the thing is, the rest of these descriptors are literal. Again, Job is being told, look at this animal. And when we look at Behemoth, and he talks about the horse previously and all these other animals, like, look at the attributes of this creature and be in awe. But when we read verses 18 to 21, we tend to, I think, look at them as figurative, but the context and the purpose of these things seem to require a literal interpretation. The word sneezings in verse 18, that refers to sneezes. So when this thing sneezes, light shines. Out of its mouth go burning lamps and sparks and fire. His breath kindles coal. He even says that flames come out of his mouth. So if we're taking this literally, which I think the context seems to require, it seems like this is an animal that breathes some sort of fire. And it sounds ridiculous almost. But I think it's only because we really don't have any experience with it. I mean, how ridiculous would these creatures sound if we lived at a time before they existed? If you didn't know about an electric eel, and I told you that there was a creature that could emit a very strong electrical pulse to stun prey, and it could actually paralyze people, I believe, doesn't really make sense. We don't know how that would work. Or I think it's called the bombardier beetle that literally spits acid out of its rear. There's a lot of things that really seem fake, but because we grew up with them, we obviously admit they're facts. And judging by this, I would seem to say that the same is true for this creature. Now, I don't believe this is a creature that's alive today, obviously. But perhaps it's worth noting, too, that throughout all the different cultures of the earth, you have accounts of creatures that do this very thing. And when we talk about the flood, one evidence that we use for that is that all these different cultures have a flood account. And there are differences in it, but the fact that you have all these different witnesses and one central fact of a flood, it points to one true fact occurring. And since the same occurs with these accounts of dragons, and again, we've seen that they've been known by man to some degree, it seems that they point to one fact in some point in history. So what is this? I really have no clue. I have 3 suggestions for you. I wouldn't say any of them check all the boxes just because we literally can't. We can't know whether something breathed fire or necessarily had scales. But the first suggestion I have is called Chronosaurus. Now, it certainly has the teeth to do the job. It's terrifying to look at, which is kind of how Leviathan is described. And as far as size goes, it seems like Leviathan's large. And this would fit this descriptor. I know I definitely would be trying to get out of the water if I saw that there. They can be about 33 feet long from snout to tail. Now, my main objection to this would be the neck. This creature, it says, it rears itself up. Which, if you ever watch any sci-fi movies, you see like a sea monster coming out and it's sticking its head way over the sea and looking down on the boats. That's kind of what this verse seems to say to me. And this would be very difficult for this creature because it doesn't have much of a neck to do that with. Another animal this could be is called, before we get there, there's some other actual skeletons and real people sitting next to them. I mean, that woman could fit in the mouth of the entire creature. It's ridiculous how scary these things can be. Another suggestion is called Dromaeosaurus. Now this has a neck that seems to be a little bit longer than Dinosaurs. You can see how it would be able to kind of rear its neck out, sort of like a duck, but a lot more menacing. And it also has the teeth and all these things that would be able to strike fear in people. Now my last suggestion, which is what I tend to lean to, is called not yet, because we're not done with our pictures. Here's just another fossil of one of these things showing the size of these creatures. My thoughts are it's called Elasmosaurus. Now, I have a couple things on this. It's the most serpent-like, because when we see how this phrase is used in prophecy, it's serpent. And we know, particularly in the prophecies, I think it is figurative. I think it is figurative, like Ken was describing. But given this context, and I would say only in this context, it seems to be a literal thing. Now these reach to be about 50 feet long, and they certainly have the neck that if you're in a boat, it'd be able to look down on you and just, I don't need you to jump in the water, you stay on the boat, I don't know what you do. But again, regarding the size of these things, truly terrible looking creatures. As far as the teeth round about, I'd say that one's got the box checked. The opening, the doors of his face, I mean, I don't know how you get your fingers in there, but it speaks to jaw strength, which it seems this creature would also have had. Now, this is another one that I think maybe the others didn't qualify as well, but just judging by the skeletal structure of this compared to seals and all these other animals, it seems that it did come on Earth, on the land that is at some times, which would give man the opportunity to see if this thing had sharp scales or anything on its stomach, it would leave marks in the mud or the sand, and man would be able to see those things. The hope of him is in vain, shall not one be cast down even at the sight of him. And again, these are mere suggestions. I don't think we'll ever know for sure. But to me, I don't think it's an animal that is alive today. Whatever it was, there's none so fierce that any dare stir him up. Yeah. Now to dragons. Now they're referred throughout the Old Testament in a number of ways. The Hebrew word most of the time is tannin. And in Strong's, like we said earlier, it means a serpent, a dragon, or a sea monster. A lot of times you see it understood as a jackal, and there's a lot of cases where that is the case. It's talking about living on land in deserted places. But there's a couple like these where jackal just doesn't fit the bill. And again, this verse in Isaiah might be most likely the, we can see it figuratively, I guess, but Isaiah 27:1, in that day the Lord with a sore and great strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, the crooked serpent. He shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. So, I mean, whether it's figurative, obviously it's got a very figurative meaning, but I mean, we use figurative things relating to the literal. But anyways, the point being that dragon can't be a jackal in this case, because jackals don't go in the sea. Psalm 74, 12 through 14, my God is my king of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. Thou didst divide the sea by strength. Thou breakest the head of the dragons in the water. Now this doesn't necessarily seem as symbolic to me. It's talking about the strength of God here. Breaks the heads of the dragons in the water. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Now, there's other things that you can talk about in this, but the main thing is that it doesn't always seem to be a jackal. So I suggest that at least in some of these places, when you find this word, it may be a large dinosaur reptile of some sort. So this brings us to when they died out. I'm afraid to switch my slide. I don't know what it's going to. Well, I don't think they died out until after the flood. Now you note in the flood account, it doesn't say take all the animals except for these. It says bring all of them, two of every kind, and so on. So I believe at least, if you've ever seen the Ark encounter, I've never actually been there, but I've seen pictures, and they have dinosaurs in there. They have young dinosaurs and other young creatures to account for fitting them all onto this one boat. And since we're specifically told that they're all to be going on the Ark, I think that the dinosaurs were present there. Now, so if we have dinosaurs described in Job, if that's the case, then we can reasonably conclude that they did, in fact, live after the flood. Now, if I'm wrong on this, somebody can correct me, but it seems that Job was written after the flood. And the reason I say this, and this is where I say I might be wrong, because I know there's people of different names, but Job was from the land of Uz. And from Genesis 10, verses 22 and 23, Uz was Shem's grandson. Now, whether that city was named after him, I don't know. It is interesting that they have the same exact name. But Uz being Shem's grandson, and Shem we don't really think had kids until he got off the ark. It seems that since Job is able to see them, the dinosaurs did in fact get off the ark. Now, when we think about that, you think, boy, how did man exist along dinosaurs? Surely They just eat every single one of us. It would have been a terrible time to live. Um, but I think Hollywood is really the only reason for that. When we see them in movies, it doesn't matter if this T-Rex has a whole sauropod that's dead right there. It's going to drop what it's got and it's going to go after these people. That's just not realistic. And I think it's just based on the fierceness of their skeletons that we think this. But I had you look at these two skeletons, and I'd ask you, just looking at this, which one would you rather run from? And probably both of them. But the one on the left it's called a trudon. It's like a small raptor. And the one on the right is a leopard seal. Now, leopard seals, I think somebody was just killed not too long ago, but in general, they're very peaceful with people. And there's actually one photographer who formed a very close bond with a leopard seal. If we only found the bones, we'd think, boy, you don't want to find whatever this thing is. Now, again, back to when these creatures would have lived. We go back to these, and these are dates prescribed. And again, we take this with a grain of salt because of those dating methods and all the assumptions. But the dates prescribed to this pottery was from around 800 BC to 200 AD. This Cambodian temple was supposedly built between the 1100s and 1400s. And I did not put whether that was BC or AD, so you may just want to disregard that for the time being. There it is, AD. Really not all that long ago, if that's accurate. This thing was from 1100 BC, and that's probably the same for all the other ones they found with T-Rex and Brachiosaurs and so on. And these Indian clay and stone things they found, they date to around 800 BC. So when did they die out? I don't know if we know for sure, but it certainly seems that they lived much longer than the scientists of today tell us. And again, they were not rediscovered until the 1800s. So what actually caused them to die out, we're pretty much at the end here. But personally, I think it was a result of just a change in the earth after the flood. I mean, such a catastrophic event like that. I mean, if you take a snow globe and you shake it up and it starts to settle down, at first it's all messed up. And I think that's how the earth was. When the great fountains of the deep broke open, I mean, it didn't rain before the flood. We read that there was a mist that went out and watered the garden. So it seems that the atmosphere was incredibly different, and it was most likely much more oxygen rich, which would allow for such large creatures. And after the flood, those things being changed, they probably just couldn't continue on physically. The atmosphere wasn't right for them. Adding to this, the weakening of the Earth's magnetic field, bringing in more rays, harmful rays of the sun. There's a number of reasons that would result in this thing. So I hope this was somewhat interesting. I do believe, based on the evidence I found, that they were part of this, and that they died out sometime between now and then, or now and obviously the past. There are people that think they're still out there. I doubt it personally, just because with all the technology we have and the size of these creatures, it'd be hard not to see them, but those are my thoughts, at least. So, thank you.
Thank you.